It's wonderful to see you all again. I've got an extraordinary tale to tell you today.
Brianna laughed as she poured the wine over Danielle Thorne's white uniform in front of the entire country club. The deep red Cabernet pooled in the fabric of the dress blues, spreading across Danielle's chest like a blooming wound. For a heartbeat, the grand ballroom of the North Hill Country Club went silent. The only sound was the rhythmic drip-drip-drip of the vintage hitting the polished marble floor. "Oh, Danny, I am so sorry," Brianna said, though her voice danced with a cruel, melodic lightness. She didn't reach for a napkin. Instead, she adjusted her own silk gown, a shimmering gold piece that cost more than Danielle's monthly salary, and turned toward the crowd of donors. "My sister is just so used to those cramped Navy offices. She's forgotten how to navigate a room with actual people in it." A few of the donors chuckled, a dry, polite sound that felt like sandpaper against Danielle's skin. Robert Thorne, standing at the head of the gala table, didn't even look up from his steak. He merely sighed, the sound of a man burdened by an inferior product. "Go clean yourself up, Danielle," her father said, his voice flat. "You're an eyesore, and when you're done, tell the kitchen we need more ice at table 4. Since you aren't contributing to the foundation's auction, you might as well be useful to the staff." Danielle stood perfectly still. Her spine was a steel rod, a habit drilled into her by years of service that her family chose to ignore. She could feel the cold, sticky liquid seeping through her undershirt, the scent of fermented grapes and expensive arrogance filling her nostrils. She didn't flush. She didn't cry. She simply watched Brianna, who was already busy framing a selfie with a local senator, her face transformed into a mask of bubbly, philanthropic grace. "Did you hear him?" Brianna whispered, leaning close so only Danielle could smell the cloying sweetness of her floral perfume. "The help enters through the kitchen, sweetie. Try not to trip on your way out. This uniform is embarrassing enough without you making a scene." Danielle's gaze shifted to Jake Miller. He sat 2 seats down, his broad shoulders hunched. He was an Army Ranger, a man who knew what real service looked like, yet he remained silent. He looked at the red stain on Danielle's chest, then at Brianna's triumphant smile, and he looked away. He owed the Thorne family his civilian career, but Danielle knew he owed his life to a ghost in a dusty valley in Cunnar, a ghost he didn't realize was standing 5 feet away from him. "I heard him," Danielle said quietly. Her voice was a low, steady hum, the sound of a predator counting breaths. She turned and walked away, her heels clicking a rhythmic military cadence against the marble. She didn't head for the kitchen. She moved toward the quiet alcove near the coat check, her hand slipping into the hidden pocket of her tunic. Her fingers brushed against the cold, hard edge of her secure mobile device. It vibrated, a sharp, insistent pulse. She pulled it out. The screen stayed dark, requiring a biometric scan. Once her thumb pressed against the glass, a single encrypted message from Commander Sarah Vance appeared. "The declassification of Operation Silver Spear is complete. The Secretary of the Navy has signed off. Your Silver Star is no longer a ghost record, Specialist Thorne. The official ceremony is set for the gala's closing. Are you ready to step out of the basement?" Danielle stared at the words. She looked back at the ballroom, where Brianna was currently standing on the stage, holding a microphone. Her sister was beginning her speech about the sacrifices the Thorne family made for the military, using Danielle's low-level administrative cover as a punchline to make herself look more heroic by comparison. "My sister serves in the shadows," Brianna told the laughing crowd, her voice amplified and sweet. "Mostly in a windowless room in D.C., filing the real hero's paperwork. But someone has to do the boring stuff, right?" Danielle felt a heat rising in her chest, but it wasn't the heat of shame. It was the cold, clinical heat of mission parameters being met. She looked down at the wine-stained white fabric of her uniform. It was ruined, but it didn't matter. Beneath the stain, tucked into her inner pocket, was the challenge coin she'd carried through 3 tour, the one she'd used to bite down on when the shrapnel was being pulled from her shoulder. She tapped a quick reply to Vance. "Proceed. But don't send the honor guard to the stage yet. I want them to see the clumsy sister one more time before the lights change." Danielle tucked the phone away. She walked back toward the ballroom, but she didn't go to the kitchen for ice. She walked straight to the tech booth behind the heavy velvet curtains. The young technician looked up, startled by the stained uniform and the intensity in Danielle's eyes. "The tribute video for my sister," Danielle said, her voice like a closing trap. "I have the updated file from the commander. We're changing the program." "Oh, okay," the boy stammered, intimidated by the sheer authority radiating from the woman he'd ignored all evening. "I didn't know there was a change." "There are a lot of things people in this room don't know," Danielle replied. She handed him a small, encrypted drive. As she walked back out into the shadows of the wings, she watched Brianna gesturing toward their father. The arrogance in the room was thick enough to choke on. They thought they knew who she was. They thought she was the quiet failure, the disappointment in the white uniform who couldn't even hold a glass of wine. Brianna was laughing again, a sound that would be the last thing she enjoyed before the world fell out from under her. Danielle leaned against the cold stone pillar, her eyes locked on the digital clock above the stage. 10 minutes. In 10 minutes, the wine stain wouldn't be the only thing people were looking at. Danielle smoothed the damp fabric of her sleeve. The plan was in motion. The desk clerk was about to file her final report, and the Thorne family wasn't going to like the conclusion. The reception at the Thorne estate smelled of forced elegance and white lilies. Brianna Thorne stood at the center of a circle of admirers, her silk gown shimmering under the massive crystal chandeliers. She was the star of the evening, the social media darling who had supposedly coordinated the relief efforts Jake Miller had survived. Every time she laughed, the sound was high and practiced, designed to draw every eye in the room toward her. Danielle Thorne watched from the periphery, standing near the shadows of the grand mahogany staircase. Her white Navy service uniform felt stiff and out of place among the designer evening wear. She didn't need the spotlight, but the heat of her sister's gaze found her anyway. "Oh, Danielle," Brianna said, her voice carrying easily across the marble foyer. She glided over, a flute of vintage champagne in her hand and a smirk playing on her lips. "I almost didn't see you there in that drab little outfit. It's a bit much for a family party, don't you think? We get it, you work in an office. You don't have to dress like a filing cabinet." Jake Miller, standing just behind Brianna, looked down at his polished boots. He was an Army Ranger, a man who knew the weight of a uniform, yet he remained silent. The guilt on his face was a flicker Danielle noted but didn't reward with a glance. He owed his life to the desk clerk he was currently ignoring, though he didn't yet know the scale of the debt. "It is a service uniform, Brianna," Danielle replied, her voice level and cold. "Service, right," Brianna laughed, a sharp, entitled sound that made the nearby guests titter. "Typing memos is hardly service, darling. While I was raising $3 million for the Veterans Fund and mapping out logistics for the rescue teams, you were probably filing someone's travel receipts in a basement. Honestly, Dad, why did she even bother coming if she was going to dress like the help?" Robert Thorne stepped forward, placing a hand on Brianna's shoulder. He didn't even look at his other daughter. "Now, Brianna, Danielle does what she can. Not everyone has your leadership skills or your public heart. Some people are just built for the background. It's a shame she can't show a little more pride in the family's image, though." He turned his attention back to Brianna, beaming with a pride he'd never once shown Danielle. "That interview you did with the Times? Incredible. To think you were the one who pinpointed the extraction zone for Jake's unit. That's the Thorne legacy. Real boots-on-the-ground intelligence." Danielle felt the weight of the encrypted drive she'd handed off earlier. She knew the truth. She was the one who had spent 48 hours without sleep in a windowless room in Bahrain, staring at satellite feeds and heat signatures, whispering coordinates into a headset to guide the Rangers through the valley, while Brianna was back in D.C. taking selfies at a charity brunch. Brianna hadn't pinpointed anything. She had just intercepted a classified report and claimed the anonymous source was her own private consultant. Danielle's phone buzzed in her pocket. She stepped back into the shadow of a towering fern and checked the screen. A message from Commander Sarah Vance. "The declassification order is signed. The Silver Star citation for Operation Red Sky is no longer under seal." The Pentagon is sending the official record to the Foundation's media liaison tonight. We're ready for the gala. A cold, calm satisfaction settled in Danielle's chest. She looked back at Brianna, who was now showing Jake a photo on her phone, her thumb flickering over the screen with practiced vanity. "Jake, look at this one," Brianna chirped, ignoring the way the ranger flinched at the mention of the mission. "The lighting is perfect. I'll post it tonight with a caption about supporting our heroes. It'll have 50,000 likes by morning." Jake nodded absently, his eyes drifting toward Danielle. He seemed to want to say something, but Brianna snapped her fingers, pointing to her empty glass. "Danielle, be a dear. My glass is empty and the catering staff is busy. Grab me a refill and find some napkins. Someone spilled red wine near the piano and it's going to stain the marble." The arrogance was a physical weight in the room. Robert laughed, nodding in agreement. "Go on, Danielle. Make yourself useful for once." "Your sister is the guest of honor." Danielle didn't move to take the glass. Instead, she stepped closer until she was inches from her sister. The scent of Brianna's expensive, cloying perfume was suffocating, but Danielle didn't flinch. "Enjoy the attention, Brianna," Danielle whispered, low enough that only her sister and Jake could hear. "The Thorne Family Foundation Gala is in 48 hours. The board of directors, the international press, the entire regional command staff. They're all coming to see the hero of the Thorne family." Brianna smirked, tossing her hair. "Of course they are. It's my night. I'm the one who saved the day, remember?" "I remember everything," Danielle said, her eyes locking onto Brianna's with a predatory stillness that finally made the other woman's smile falter. "It's going to be a night no one ever forgets. I've made sure the program is comprehensive." She turned and walked away, the sound of her heels on the marble sounding like a countdown. She had 48 hours to ensure that when the curtain rose at the gala, the only thing Brianna Thorne would be famous for was the truth. The morning fog rolled off the lake, clinging to the manicured hedges of the Thorne estate like a damp shroud. Danielle stood on the stone terrace, the porcelain cup in her hand radiating a warmth that failed to reach her bones. She took a sip of the bitter black coffee, her eyes scanning the perimeter with a habit she couldn't break. "You don't hold a cup like a civilian," a voice said from the shadows of the patio doorway. Danielle didn't flinch. She had heard the footsteps, heavy, rhythmic, favoring the left side, long before the voice spoke. She turned slowly to see Jake Miller leaning against the brickwork. The morning light caught the fresh scar running down his jaw, a souvenir from the ambush that had supposedly made her sister a hero. "Good morning, Jake," she said, her voice neutral. "Coffee." Ignored the offer. He limped forward, stopping 3 feet from her, close enough to intimidate if she were the kind of woman who could be intimidated. "I couldn't sleep, kept thinking about the tourniquet." Danielle took another sip. "The doctors said it saved your leg." It did. It was a combat application tourniquet applied with a windlass mechanism improvised from a branch and a strip of canvas. Jake's eyes, dark and searching, locked onto hers. "Brianna told the press she used her scarf. She said she just knew what to do. But when I asked her about the pressure points last night, she thought I was talking about a massage." The wind rustled the oak trees, the sound like distant static. Danielle set her cup on the railing. "Trauma affects memory, Jake. People get confused." "I don't," he snapped. "And neither do you. I watched you yesterday, Danielle. When that waiter dropped the tray, you didn't jump. You shifted your weight to your back foot and scanned the exits. That's not what an unemployed art school dropout does." He lowered his voice, the gravelly tone of a man used to giving orders. "Who tied that knot?" Danielle looked at him, really looked at him. She saw the pain behind his eyes, the confusion of a soldier who owed a life debt to a fraud. She reached into the pocket of her oversized cardigan, her fingers brushing the cold metal of an encrypted flash drive she'd retrieved earlier. "The gala is tomorrow night," she said softly. "I don't care about the damn party." "You should, because the truth isn't something you whisper in a garden, Jake. It's something you scream." She stepped closer, invading his personal space, dropping the facade of the meek sister for a fraction of a second. "If you want to know who saved your life, be in the front row at 1900 hours. And until then, keep your mouth shut." Jake stared at her, the realization dawning slowly, replacing the anger with shock. He nodded once, a soldier acknowledging a superior officer, and stepped back. Inside the house, the atmosphere was less tactical and more theatrical. The scent of fresh lilies, hundreds of them, was nauseatingly sweet, choking the air in the grand foyer. Brianna stood in the center of the chaos, wearing a silk robe that cost more than a mid-grade sedan, screaming at a terrified florist. "I said *heroic white," Brianna shrieked, gesturing wildly with a half-empty mimosa glass. "These are off-white. They look like surrender flags. Do I look like I surrender?" Robert Thorne emerged from his study, looking weary but indulgent. He patted Brianna's shoulder. Now, princess, the lighting will make them look perfect. Save your energy for the speech." He turned to Danielle, his expression hardening instantly. "Danielle, don't just stand there. Help the staff move these vases. Your sister is exhausted. The PTSD triggers are bad today." The audacity hit Danielle like a physical blow. She felt the rage spike, hot and sharp, behind her ribs. Brianna, who had spent the ambush cowering in the back of the transport vehicle while Danielle returned fire and dragged 3 men to safety, was now claiming combat stress. "Of course, Dad," Danielle said, her voice smooth. "We wouldn't want the hero to strain herself." Brianna smirked, sipping her mimosa. "Exactly. Some of us actually contribute to this family's legacy, Danny. The least you can do is lift a few boxes. It's not like you have a job to get to." "Actually," Danielle said, picking up a heavy crystal vase with effortless stability, "I'm expecting a delivery." "More rejection letters?" Brianna laughed, the sound brittle and cruel. "Or maybe you ordered a personality online." The heavy oak front door opened, and a uniformed courier stepped in, looking out of place amidst the floral explosion. He held a thick, rigid envelope with red security tape. "Delivery for Commander Thorne," the courier announced, looking at the manifest. Robert frowned, stepping forward. "There must be a mistake. I'm Mr. Thorne. My daughter Brianna is the guest of honor, but she's not military. Yet." He beamed at Brianna. "Though the governor is discussing an honorary commission." "It says Commander, sir. Must be signed for by the addressee." "It's obviously a clerical error," Brianna scoffed, waving a hand dismissively. "Just sign for it, Dad. It's probably my award notification sent to the wrong title." Danielle set the vase down. The sound of heavy crystal hitting the marble table echoed like a gavel strike. "I'll take it." Robert turned to her, annoyed. "Danielle, don't interfere with official business. This is for your sister." "No," Danielle said. She walked past her father, past the sister who had stolen her Valor, and stood before the courier. She pulled her ID from her pocket, not her driver's license, but the military identification she hadn't shown anyone in this house for 6 years. She flashed it quickly, just for the courier's eyes. The courier's posture straightened instinctively. "Ma'am, sign here, please." Danielle signed the pad, the stylus gliding smoothly across the screen. She took the package. It was heavy, heavier than paper. She knew exactly what the weight meant. Inside was the declassified after-action report, authorized by Commander Vance, and the velvet box containing the silver star she had earned in the blood and dust of that valley. "What is that?" Brianna demanded, stepping closer, her eyes narrowing with suspicion. "If that's a gift for the gala, hand it over." Danielle clutched the package against her side. The texture of the rigid cardboard felt like armor. "It's just some old paperwork, Brianna. Nothing you'd understand. It requires clearance." She turned and walked toward the stairs. "Don't walk away from me," Brianna shouted, her voice rising to that shrill pitch that usually made the staff cower. "I am the face of this family. I am the one everyone is coming to see." Danielle paused on the 3rd step. She looked down at her sister, then at her father, who was shaking his head in disappointment at Danielle's rudeness. "You're right, Brianna," Danielle said, a small, cold smile touching her lips. "They are all coming to see you. I've made sure of it." She continued up the stairs, the package pressed against her heart. 24 hours. The clock was ticking, and for the first time in years, the lion was awake. The morning sun filtered through the high windows of the dining room, illuminating the chaotic spread of seating charts, floral samples, and menu drafts covering the mahogany table. The air smelled of aggressive starch and the cloying sweetness of the lilies Brianna had ordered by the truckload. Danielle Thorne stood in the doorway, a mug of black coffee in her hand. She watched her sister move pieces of paper around like a general commanding an army of napkins. "Move the senator to table 4, Brianna snapped at the weary assistant hovering by her elbow. "And keep him away from the press. I want the spotlight on me when the donation is announced, not his re-election campaign." The assistant scurried to obey. Brianna didn't look up. She didn't need to. She assumed the space she occupied belonged to her by divine right. "You're going to burn out the staff before the doors even open," Danielle said, her voice level. Brianna's head snapped up. Her eyes narrowed, scanning Danielle's simple gray sweater and jeans with practiced disdain. "Some of us have responsibilities, Danielle. We can't all float through life on Daddy's charity." She picked up a heavy fountain pen, the gold nib scratching loudly against the seating chart. "Besides, this gala is the most important night of the decade for Thorne Enterprises. It has to be perfect." "I have to be perfect." Danielle took a slow sip of coffee. The heat of the ceramic warmed her fingers. "Is that why you moved the board members to the back of the room?" "They're boring," Brianna dismissed, waving a manicured hand. "Old money, old ideas, they need to see the future. They need to see me." "They hold the controlling vote, Brianna." Danielle stepped into the room, her sneakers silent on the plush rug. "Ignoring them is dangerous. If you push them too far into the shadows, you might not like what they do in the dark." It was a clear warning. A lifeline thrown to a drowning woman who thought she was walking on water. Brianna laughed. It was a sharp, brittle sound. "I don't fear the board. They're toothless. Dad eats out of my hand, and where he goes, they follow." "You'd know that if you ever actually participated in this family instead of just leeching off it." She turned back to her charts, effectively dismissing her sister. "Now, go find something to do that doesn't involve breathing my air. I have a stylist coming in 20 minutes. The doorbell chimed, echoing through the cavernous hall. "That's probably him," Brianna said. "Go let him in, try to look like you work here at least." Danielle walked to the foyer, her expression unreadable. She opened the heavy oak door, but it wasn't a stylist. Jake Miller stood on the porch, a garment bag slung over his shoulder. He looked tired, the lines around his eyes deeper than Danielle remembered from their brief encounter days ago. "Delivery," Jake said, his voice rough. Brianna's dress needed emergency alterations. "She's in the dining room," Danielle said, stepping back. As Jake passed, he paused. He looked at her, really looked at her in a way the others didn't. He had seen combat. He knew what a threat looked like. He saw the stillness in her posture, the lack of fidgeting, the way her eyes tracked the environment rather than drifting aimlessly. "You okay?" he asked, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Never better," Danielle replied. A small, genuine smile touched her lips, but it didn't reach her eyes, just preparing for the show. Jake frowned, sensing the double meaning but unable to decode it. "Right, well, good luck." He walked into the dining room and Danielle listened. "Finally," Brianna's voice carried effortlessly. "Hang it over there and be careful, Jake. That silk costs more than your truck." "I know, Bri," Jake's voice was resigned. "I paid for the insurance on the transport." "As you should." There was a rustle of fabric. "God, look at this. It's a coronation gown. Tomorrow, when I walk onto that stage, there won't be a doubt in anyone's mind who owns this city." Danielle leaned against the doorframe, unseen. She pulled her phone from her pocket. A single notification sat on the screen from Commander Vance. "Package received. Legal is ready. Green light for 1900 hours." She thumbed a reply. Understood. Inside the dining room, Brianna was still talking, her voice rising with manic excitement. "I'm going to announce the restructuring right after the toast. Dad doesn't even know yet. I'm going to push him into retirement live on stage. He can't say no in front of 500 people." The audacity was breathtaking. Brianna wasn't just planning a party, she was planning a coup. She just didn't realize she was launching it against a superior force. Danielle slipped the phone back into her pocket. She felt the weight of the flash drive she carried there, the digital copy of the evidence she had secured yesterday. It felt heavy, like a loaded weapon. "You really think he'll just step down?" Jake asked, skepticism coloring his tone. "He won't have a choice," Brianna sneered. "Power is about perception, Jake, and tomorrow I will look like the queen and he will look like the tired old king ready to sleep." Danielle turned and walked away, heading toward the library. The warning had been ignored. The arrogance had been confirmed. The witness had seen the dynamic. She entered the quiet of the library and closed the door, sealing out the noise of Brianna's ambition. She walked to the window, looking out over the manicured grounds where the tent was being erected. Tomorrow. She placed her hand against the cool glass. Brianna wanted a coronation. Danielle would give her an execution. The clock on the mantel ticked loudly in the silence. 24 hours. Danielle closed her eyes and exhaled slowly. The lion wasn't just awake anymore. It was hunting. The scent of 5,000 white lilies was suffocating, a thick, cloying perfume that masked the smell of desperation in the room. The grand ballroom of the Thorne estate had been transformed into a temple of excess. Crystal chandeliers, each the size of a small car, dripped light onto the marble floors, fracturing into rainbows that danced across the faces of the city's elite. Brianna Thorne stood at the center of it all, a beacon in shimmering gold silk. The dress was a masterpiece of structural engineering, designed to highlight every asset and conceal every flaw, much like the company she was about to claim. She laughed at something a senator whispered, her head thrown back, the diamonds at her throat catching the light. It was a practiced pose, one she had perfected in the mirror for weeks. To the casual observer, she was the picture of a young heiress ready to ascend. To anyone paying attention, she was a shark in a fish tank, circling. Robert Thorne stood beside her, his chest puffed out, a glass of scotch in his hand. He looked at his daughter with the kind of pride he usually reserved for quarterly earnings reports. He clapped the senator on the back, his voice booming over the string quartet playing softly in the corner. They were celebrating a victory that hadn't happened yet, counting chickens that were about to be slaughtered. Danielle Thorne stepped through the archway of the main entrance. She didn't announce herself. She didn't stumble. She simply appeared. Unlike the pastel sea of gowns around her, she wore midnight blue, a column of fabric so dark it seemed to absorb the light. It was severe, sharp, and cut with military precision. She wore no diamonds, only a simple silver watch on her left wrist. The air in the room seemed to shift, a subtle drop in pressure that pricked the back of the neck. Jake Miller was the first to see her. He stood near the open bar, nursing a drink he hadn't touched in 20 minutes. His knuckles were white against the glass. When his eyes landed on Danielle, he flinched. He looked from her to Brianna, then back again, his face draining of color. He knew what was in the envelope tucked inside Danielle's structured clutch. He knew that the ground beneath this party was hollow. Danielle moved through the crowd. She didn't weave, she cut a path. Guests parted instinctively, sensing a momentum that had nothing to do with social grace and everything to do with force. "You came," a voice sneered. Brianna blocked her path, a flute of champagne held dangerously loose in her fingers. Up close, the gold dress looked like armor. Her eyes, heavily lined and hard as flint, raked over her sister's outfit. "I wouldn't miss it," Danielle said. Her voice was low, smooth, and utterly devoid of warmth. "I'm surprised security let you in the front door," Brianna said, stepping closer, invading Danielle's personal space. The smell of expensive vintage champagne and ambition rolled off her. "I specifically told them the service entrance was for staff and family stragglers." "Must have been a miscommunication," Danielle replied. She didn't step back. She didn't blink. She held Brianna's gaze until the younger woman's smile faltered, just for a fraction of a second. "Well, try not to ruin the aesthetic," Brianna snapped, recovering her composure. She pointed a manicured finger toward the back of the room, near the kitchen swing doors. "Table 19. It's behind the pillar. Try to stay there. The press is here, and I don't want them asking who the charity case is." It was the kind of comment that would have crushed the old Danielle. It would have sent her retreating to the shadows, cheeks burning. But the woman standing in the midnight blue dress simply nodded, a faint, terrifying smile touching her lips. "Table 19, Danielle repeated. "Perfect vantage point." "For what?" Brianna asked, her eyes narrowing. "For the show." Danielle walked past her sister, the silk of her dress brushing against the gold gown with a sound like a whisper. She felt Brianna's eyes boring into her back, hot and angry, but she didn't turn. She made her way to the back of the room, to the small, round table shrouded in shadow near the kitchen service doors. She sat down. The chair was wobbly. The tablecloth had a small stain near the hem. From here, the head table was a distant stage, elevated on a platform, bathed in spotlights. Jake materialized beside her a moment later. He didn't sit. He hovered, looking like a man waiting for a firing squad. "You're actually going to do it," he whispered. It wasn't a question. "Sit down, Jake," she said, placing her clutch on the table. She rested her hand on it. The leather was cool under her palm. "You're drawing attention." "Brianna thinks she's announcing the merger tonight," he hissed, sliding into the chair opposite her. He kept glancing toward the front of the room. "She thinks she's being named CEO. I know what she thinks. Robert signed the papers this morning. It's done, Danny. Unless you stop it now, she wins." Danielle picked up a glass of water the waiter had left. She watched the condensation slide down the side, pooling on the cheap linen. "The papers aren't worth the ink they're signed with, Jake. You can't transfer assets you don't own." "She's going to destroy you if this goes wrong," Jake said, his voice trembling. "She has the board, the lawyers, the press." "She has an audience," Danielle corrected. She looked up, her eyes locking onto the stage where Robert was tapping a spoon against his glass. The sharp asterisk ting-ting-ting cut through the murmur of the crowd. Silence rippled outward from the head table, a wave of expectant hush. "And that is exactly what I need." "Ladies and gentlemen," Robert's voice boomed, amplified by the microphone. He beamed, his face flushed with triumph. "If I could have your attention." The room turned. 500 faces looked toward the stage. "Tonight is a historic night for Thorne Enterprises," Robert continued, placing a heavy hand on Brianna's shoulder. She preened under the touch, glowing in the spotlight. "Tonight, we look to the future." Danielle opened her clutch. Her fingers brushed the cold metal of a USB drive and the crisp edge of a folded legal document. "We have built this legacy on strength," Robert said. "On family." The irony was so sharp it almost drew blood. Danielle stood up. In the back of the room, in the shadows of table 19, the movement was small but purposeful. She picked up her clutch. "And there is no one," Robert shouted, caught up in his own rhetoric, "no one more suited to lead us into this new era than my daughter, Brianna." Applause began to swell, polite and dutiful. Brianna stepped forward to the microphone, her smile triumphant, her hands raising to quiet the room she believed she owned. She opened her mouth to accept her coronation. Danielle stepped out from behind the pillar. She didn't shout. She simply walked toward the center aisle, her heels striking the marble with a rhythmic, military cadence that cut through the applause like a metronome. Click, clack, click, clack. Heads began to turn. The applause faltered, then died away, strangled by confusion. Brianna froze at the podium, her hands hovering over the wood. She squinted against the glare of the spotlights, trying to see who had dared to move while she was speaking. When she saw the figure in dark blue advancing down the center aisle, her expression shifted from confusion to pure, unadulterated rage. "Security!" Brianna barked into the microphone, her voice shrill. "Remove her." Two large men in black suits stepped out from the shadows near the stage. They moved toward Danielle. Danielle didn't stop. She didn't look at the guards. She looked past them, past Brianna, past her father, to the side entrance where a tall woman in a navy dress uniform had just entered, flanked by two federal agents. Commander Vance caught Danielle's eye and nodded once. Danielle stopped 10 feet from the stage. The room was deadly silent now. The only sound was the hum of the ventilation and the frantic beating of hearts. "I believe," Danielle said, her voice projecting clearly without a microphone, "there's been a mistake regarding the ownership of this company." Brianna laughed. It was a jagged, nervous sound. "You're drunk," she sneered, gripping the podium until her knuckles turned white. "Get out." Danielle reached into her clutch. She pulled out the document, the paper stark white against her dark dress. She held it up not to Brianna, but to the board members sitting in the front row. "The mistake," Danielle said, "is thinking you can inherit what was never yours to begin with." Danielle didn't flinch. She ignored the security guards hovering at the edge of the stage and walked directly toward the front row. The cloying scent of white lilies, arranged in massive displays for the anniversary gala, felt suffocating in the sudden, heavy silence of the ballroom. Every eye in the room followed her. Reporters, shareholders, and the high society vultures who had spent the last hour whispering about her modest attire. She stopped in front of the board chair, a silver-haired man named Arthur who had known her since she was a child. With a steady hand, she placed the heavy vellum folder on the table. The sharp snap of the folder opening echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. "Read the third page, Arthur," Danielle said. Her voice was as cold as the air conditioning humming through the vents. "Specifically the section regarding the Valkyrie Trust and the military-grade intelligence patents that fund 80% of this company's annual revenue." Brianna laughed again, but the sound was thin, vibrating with a frantic energy. She gripped the edges of the podium so hard her knuckles turned white, her designer rings catching the light. "Don't listen to her. She's desperate. She's been a low-level analyst for years, while I've been the face of this family's legacy. She's probably high on whatever they gave her for the stress of her desk job." Robert Thorne stood up, his face flushed a deep, angry red. He reached out to grab Danielle's arm, his voice a low, warning hiss. "Danielle, enough. You're embarrassing yourself in this family. Leave now and we'll talk about getting you help in the morning. Don't ruin your sister's night." Danielle stepped out of his reach, her gaze never leaving Arthur's face. The board chair had gone perfectly still. His eyes scanned the document, then darted to the tall woman in the navy uniform standing by the door. This is an original citation," Arthur whispered, his hands beginning to tremble. "And a transfer of majority voting shares. It's dated 5 years ago." "What are you talking about?" Brianna snapped, her voice rising to a shrill peak. She abandoned the podium and marched toward the table. "That's impossible. Dad owns those shares. He's passing them to me tonight." Brianna's face didn't just lose color. It seemed to physically collapse under the weight of the silence. The practiced, porcelain mask she curated for her millions of followers shattered, leaving behind a frantic, hollow-eyed stranger. Her skin turned a sickly, translucent gray, making the heavy contouring on her cheekbones look like dirt against ash. Her mouth worked soundlessly, opening and closing like a landed fish, while her pupils dilated until her eyes were nothing but twin pits of dark panic. The arrogance that usually held her shoulders high evaporated, leaving her slumped and small. It was the look of someone watching their entire reality dissolve into a digital hallucination. Jake Miller stepped forward from the shadows of the stage, his eyes fixed on the document. He looked at the silver star citation clipped to the back, the one Danielle had never mentioned. He looked at the date, the location, and the name of the operative who had pulled his ranger squad out of the fire in the Cunnar Valley. His face went slack, a mixture of awe and profound shame washing over him as he realized he had been engaged to a woman who mocked the person who actually saved his life. "It's real," Jake whispered, his voice cracking. He looked at Danielle as if seeing her for the first time in a decade. "The Valkyrie! It was you." Commander Sarah Vance stepped into the light, the gold braid on her uniform gleaming. "Intelligence Specialist Danielle Thorne is the sole holder of the patents governing Thorne Global's defense contracts. Per the sleeping lion clause in the original trust, her return to civilian life triggers an immediate reclamation of all board-managed assets." The room erupted into a frenzy of hushed gasps. Shareholders began to pull away from Robert and Brianna as if their failure was contagious. 2 board members immediately stood up, distancing themselves from the Thorne family patriarch. Brianna let out a strangled cry, reaching for the document, but Arthur pulled it away. She looked around the room, searching for a camera, a fan, anyone to validate her, but she found only cold, judging eyes. Danielle leaned in close to her sister, the scent of Brianna's expensive perfume now smelling like desperation. "You told everyone I didn't belong in this room," Danielle said, her voice a low, steady blade that cut through the noise. "You were right. I don't belong in a room full of frauds, but I do own the building." She turned to Arthur, ignoring her father's stunned, pleading expression. "I expect a full audit of the discretionary spending accounts Brianna has been using for her charity tour by Monday morning. Any resistance will be met with a federal inquiry." Without waiting for a response, Danielle turned and walked toward the exit. She didn't look back at the wreckage of her sister's reputation or her father's legacy. She met Commander Vance's nod with a sharp, final salute of her own. As she pushed through the heavy oak doors, the last thing she heard was Brianna's voice, broken and hysterical, screaming about her follower count to a room that was already turning its back. The silence following the heavy thud of the oak doors was more deafening than the confrontation itself. In the grand ballroom, the air felt thick, heavy with the scent of expensive floor wax and the metallic tang of collective shock. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then, the social vacuum Danielle Thorne had left behind was filled by the frantic, high-pitched scratching of Brianna Thorne's fingernails against her phone's screen. "This isn't happening," she hissed, her voice cracking as she stared at the live-stream comments scrolling past. The hero's sister persona she had built was evaporating in a bonfire of digital vitriol. Brianna's face didn't just fall, it seemed to dissolve. The carefully curated mask of the benevolent influencer shattered, leaving behind a frantic, pale creature. Her eyes, usually wide and sparkling for the camera, shrunk into dark pinpricks of terror as she scanned the crowd for a single sympathetic face. Her jaw hung slack, her lip trembling so violently that the expensive gloss she'd applied an hour ago began to smear against her teeth. The high, sharp color of her cheeks faded into a sickly, grayish pallor, her breath coming in short, ragged hitches that rattled in her chest like a dying engine. She looked less like a social media star and more like a cornered animal, realizing the cage was made of her own lies. Robert Thorne stepped forward, his face a mask of purple-hued rage. He ignored his younger daughter's collapse, his eyes fixed on the woman standing near the projector, the woman who had authorized the destruction of his evening. "Commander Vance," he barked, attempting to use the same booming authority that usually sent interns scurrying. "I don't know what kind of stunt my daughter thinks she's pulling, but this is a private family matter. You will hand over those files and exit this building immediately. This audit is over before it begins." Commander Sarah Vance didn't flinch. She adjusted the cuff of her dress uniform, the silver eagle on her shoulder catching the light. "Mr. Thorne, you seem to be under a profound misapprehension. This isn't a family dispute. This is a formal inquiry into the misappropriation of funds linked to a veteran-affiliated nonprofit. And as for the building," she glanced around the opulent room with a thin, sharp smile, "the owner has already given me her express permission to remain as long as necessary." "She's lying," Brianna screamed, finally finding her voice. She lunged toward the projector, her designer heels skidding on the marble. "Danielle doesn't own anything. She's a glorified clerk. She's a nobody who's jealous of my life." The outburst was met not with support, but with a physical retreat. The board members, men and women who had spent the last hour toasted to Brianna's vision, suddenly found the far corners of the room very interesting. Arthur, the board chairman, took a deliberate step back, his hands raised as if to wash them of the entire Thorne family. Two other socialites who had been whispering in the front row turned their backs entirely, their hushed tones carrying phrases like fraud and reputation suicide through the still air. Jake Miller stood frozen in the center of the room. His gaze was fixed on the screen where the final slide still glowed, a copy of the Silver Star citation he'd never known existed. He looked at Brianna, really looked at her as she clawed at the air. The woman he had almost married looked like a stranger. The scent of her perfume, once sweet, now felt cloying and suffocating. "Jake," Brianna sobbed, reaching for his arm. Tell them she's crazy." He pulled his arm away as if her touch burned. "She saved us," he whispered, his voice thick with a realization that felt like a physical blow to the gut. "In that valley, it wasn't the support network or the logistics you bragged about. It was her, and you knew the whole time." "I did what I had to for the brand," she shrieked, her entitlement finally stripping away the last of her dignity. "What was she going to do with the credit? She's just a shadow. I'm the one people love." Robert Thorne turned to Jake, his expression desperate. "Now see here, son, we can fix this. A few calls to the right people, a retraction." "There won't be any calls, Robert," Vance interrupted, her voice a low, steady hum of impending doom. She signaled to two men in dark suits standing by the entrance. The federal audit team is already in the basement. They're securing the servers as we speak. I suggest you find a very good lawyer, preferably one who doesn't mind a client with frozen assets. The elder Thorne's bravado vanished. He sank into one of the gilded chairs, the air seemingly leaving his lungs in a long, defeated hiss. He looked at the room he had spent a lifetime trying to dominate, only to realize he was sitting in a house owned by the daughter he had spent a decade dismissing. Outside, the cool night air hit Danielle as she walked toward the black SUV waiting at the curb. The city sounds, the distant hum of traffic, the rhythmic pulse of a nearby siren, felt clean. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the small, velvet box containing the silver star. She didn't need to wear it. The weight of it was enough. She climbed into the back seat, the leather cool against her skin. As the driver pulled away, she caught a glimpse of the ballroom windows high above. From this distance, the elite of the city looked like tiny, frantic insects trapped in a jar of their own making. Her phone buzzed in her lap. A single message from Vance. The exodus has begun. They're jumping ship before the first subpoena hits. Danielle didn't reply. She leaned her head back and closed her eyes, listening to the quiet hum of the engine. For the first time in 5 years, the shadows were gone. She wasn't a ghost anymore. The car turned the corner, leaving the Thorne legacy to crumble in the rearview mirror. Danielle knew the real work was just beginning, the legal battles, the depositions, the inevitable attempts at hollow apologies. But as the city lights blurred into long streaks of gold, she realized she wasn't waiting for the storm anymore. She was the storm. 6 months had passed since the gala lights had dimmed, and the Thorne empire had begun its slow, agonizing collapse into federal receivership. The morning air in the capital was crisp, carrying the scent of damp pavement and the faint, metallic tang of the nearby river. Inside the glass-walled corridors of the National Security Complex, the rhythmic hum of encrypted servers provided a steady pulse to Danielle's new life. She didn't walk through these halls as a ghost or a socialite. She walked with the measured, quiet authority of a director. She paused at her desk, setting down a cup of black coffee that actually tasted of beans rather than the oversweetened pretension Brianna used to favor. Her new office was sparse, functional, clean, and entirely hers. On the corner of the mahogany surface sat a small, velvet-lined box. Inside, the silver star she had once kept buried in a footlocker now caught the morning light. She didn't need to hide the price of her service anymore. Her phone buzzed. It wasn't an encrypted line from Commander Sarah Vance, who was currently overseeing the final transition of Danielle's task force. It was a restricted number. Danielle hesitated, then swiped to listen to the voicemail that had just been left. "Danielle, it's me." The voice was thin, stripped of its usual melodic artifice. Brianna Thorne sounded like she was speaking from the bottom of a well. "The landlord is threatening to put my things on the street. It's a basement apartment, Danielle. There's mold. I've been banned from 3 more platforms because the harassment filters keep flagging my truth-telling videos. I just need $50,000, alone, for the sake of the brand. You owe me that much for what you did to our reputation." Danielle felt a familiar spark of heat in her chest, a rage spike that hadn't quite faded even after half a year. The audacity was a living thing. Even now, stripped of her designer wardrobe and living in a space smaller than her former walk-in closet, her sister still spoke of reputations and loans as if the world were a vending machine designed for her convenience. Danielle deleted the message without a word. She had already signed the final documents that morning to liquidate the last of the Thorne family holdings. The money wouldn't go to basement apartments or comeback wardrobes. It was being diverted into a trust for the families of the soldiers Robert Thorne had spent decades dismissing. She looked out the window, watching the commuters below. Somewhere in the suburbs, her father was sitting in a 2-bedroom rental, waiting for a legal team that would never arrive. He had sent a letter last week, written on cheap stationery that smelled of stale tobacco. He hadn't asked how she was. He had asked if she could use her new friends to make the subpoenas go away. He still called her soldier in the letters, but now it sounded like a plea rather than a dismissal. The cost of the truth had been the total evaporation of her past. She had no family home to return to, no childhood photos that weren't tainted by the memory of the people who had stood by while she was erased. She was the victor, but the spoils were heavy with the weight of what had been broken to win them. A sharp rap on the door frame broke her reverie. Jake Miller stood there, looking healthier than he had in years. He wore a simple flannel shirt, his posture no longer weighed down by the guilt of a secret he hadn't known he was keeping. He held 2 files in his hand, the paper crisp and white. "The final depositions are in," he said, his voice steady. "The board members aren't just jumping ship anymore. They're testifying against each other. It's over, Danielle, truly over." "I know," she replied, her voice calm. She felt the secret power of that knowledge, the realization that she no longer had to wait for the other shoe to drop. She was the one who had dropped it. She picked up her pen and signed the final authorization for the asset seizure. It was a small movement, a flick of the wrist, but it felt like the final seal on a tomb. "Vance is waiting in the briefing room," Jake added, lingering for a moment. "She said to tell you the storm has cleared." Danielle nodded, but as she stood to join them, she caught her reflection in the glass. She looked older, perhaps, but the shadows behind her eyes had been replaced by a cold, clear light. She reached into her drawer and pulled out a single, weathered photograph, the only one she'd kept. It was of her and her father before the service, before the lies. She looked at it for a long second, feeling the final tether snap. She didn't tear it. She didn't burn it. She simply laid it face down on the empty desk and walked out, the click of her heels on the polished floor echoing in the silence of the room. She was moving toward a future she had built with her own hands, leaving the ruins of the Thorne name to be swept away by the very justice they had tried to buy. The house was gone, the name was a warning, and for the first time in her life, the silence wasn't a mask. It was peace.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.